Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. One of the big political events last year was the passing of climate change legislation committing Australia to a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Not only is it good for the environment, but it also provides a lot more certainty for business. They now know the rules by which they have to operate. But what are the expectations of investors on this front? Well, one of the key expectations is that the transition to a low-carbon future is a fair and just one. And listed companies that don't bring along their workers and their communities might just risk their social licence to operate. The Australian Council of Superannuation Investors is a group of 26 super funds who manage over $1 trillion in assets. I've mentioned this statistic before, but it bears repeating. On average, they own 10% of every company on the ASX 200. They are influential. Louise Davidson is the Chief Executive Officer of ACSI. Louise, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
So what do investors expect from companies as they move away from emissions-intensive operations?
There's lots and lots of different things that we think companies need to be doing. The particular issue that you were talking about just now was how we make sure that communities that have a really big exposure to emissions-intensive industries don't end up getting left behind in this transition. And so examples of the kinds of industries that we're talking about would be, fossil fuel generation assets, coal-fired power stations, might be coal mines, might be, some of those heavy industries that have a high emissions base. And I guess what we're really concerned about, it's so important for us to make this transition, and we've got so little time to do it, that making sure that we don't leave people behind is really important, because that might lead to, resistance as well as to social unrest, high unemployment in those communities. And so I think from an investor perspective, we want this transition to happen as smoothly and as gradually as possible, rather than, creating unnecessary chaos.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. You're saying those of us who live in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Adelaide and in a sense kind of support the transition of the economy, that's a very sort of different state of mind to a coal miner in Queensland, for example, outback Queensland, where there may not be a lot of other work. That's kind of the comparison you're making, and the importance of looking after that individual who is in outback Queensland, who has just as many rights and are as important as a person like me sitting in Sydney.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, it's broader than just the coal miner, because, of course, there are whole communities that exist around, coal mines or electricity generators and so on. And so it's really about making sure that the transition takes into account all of those people and communities. So this is a job, obviously, for companies, because companies are the kind of big interest for us, because our members are invested in those companies. And so we want to have information from companies to show us, what their plans are, and, to demonstrate that there is detailed planning underway. Of course, it's also going to be a big job for government, because, this is not something that can happen in isolation from government.
What are the risks if you don't have, or if you have an unjust transition?
The risks are that there are whole communities or whole workforces that are left with abrupt change to their circumstance, who don't have an opportunity to make transition to other employment opportunities or other locations. And so, for a start, that's not really what we would see as being a fair situation. And we think that companies who let that happen around their operations, there's a lot of reputational risk attached to that. And so companies that sustain significant reputational risk often lose a lot of value as well. And so we don't want to see that happen. The other thing that we are concerned about is that if there is a really widespread failure to manage this transition in a fair way, there's a risk that, that we might see large swathes of unemployment, that we might see social unrest, and that we might see increased resistance to making the transition in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors represents really big investors. And so at face value, it wasn't clear to me why it matters to you so much. But you've just put it, I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it's also financially the right thing to do. And in terms of economics, it's a good thing to do.
That's right. And, so from our perspective, one of the things that we really work on behalf of our members is protecting their investment in companies against big economic shocks that could be avoided, and so we see this as being an economic shock that can be avoided. And, it just makes a lot of sense for us to really be asking companies to be doing the planning and to be transparent about their planning as well, and to be working with their local communities and making sure that they are working with all the stakeholders who've got such a keen interest in what is going to happen to their local area.
Stay with me, Louise. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Louise Davidson, Chief Executive of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. In the last couple of years, we've had some very high-profile cases where investors have marked down companies, Rio Tinto and Yukon Gorge in Western Australia being an example, AGL Energy's desire to split into two being another example. That your members are very powerful and your organisation is very powerful. It must be sometimes challenging to make sure they're all working in the same direction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for us, one of the things that simplifies, making sure everything's working in the right direction is we've got a really clear remit from our members, which is to improve the performance of companies on environmental, social and governance issues, on ESG issues. And so, climate change clearly is one of the really big issues in that basket. And investors really like certainty, and they really like the idea of the transition happening in a planned, gradual and orderly way, and so that's one of the real focuses for us is how do we make sure that companies are approaching this in a way that's going to deliver on that, planned and orderly transition.
Are the companies getting better at it?
Yes. I mean, there's a really big range, actually, as you might expect, I guess, in how well companies are or are not managing this. But one of the things that we did find when we were doing this work that we've recently done on just transition is that Australian companies are probably not as far advanced as some of their international peers. So we are seeing some international companies who are reporting in a much more detailed fashion on what they're doing to make sure that the transition is just for their workforce and communities.
Okay. What about, are there some sectors that are better than others, or are there some sectors that it's just easier to do it?
Oh, well, there are sectors where it's easier. I mean, the lower your carbon exposure, I suppose. And then if you look at companies that have a high carbon exposure, there's also some geographies probably where it's easier as well, where it might be more practical to be pivoting to renewable generation where instead of coal-fired generation, or there might be other physical assets nearby that can be, be used to replace the income from whatever the fossil fuel industry was. So, so it really varies. And I think that's one of the things about this is it's very context specific. And so one of the things we think, so in addition to asking companies to take certain actions, we're also asking governments to take certain actions. And we would like to see the federal government, really play an oversight role here, an enabling role for, particularly for local government, because I think local government's going to play a really key role here.
And a lot of these assets, Sydney Airport's an example, potentially Origin Energy, they're not actually going to be listed either. So organisations like yours will have less influence unless, of course, your members are shareholder that own a big chunk of it. But government probably needs a role to play for those unlisted assets too.
Yeah, that's true. But actually, as you point out, so our members, I mean, the work that my organisation does is focused on listed companies, but our members do have big exposure to unlisted assets, particularly property and infrastructure. And so they will also be working with those organisations on a lot of these issues at the same time. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach, if you like.
Yeah. So for 2023, this obviously for ACSI is for the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, it's kind of a very high priority. Do you think it's a very high priority for your members as well?
Yeah, I think this is, so climate change in general and its impact on investments and on the economy And this transition, this economic transition that we need to make is huge, and it's going to affect really every facet of investment and of our economic life, I think. So, getting it right, apart from obviously the survivability of the planet, which is kind of important as well.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Getting it right is pretty critical.
Louise, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
That's a pleasure. It was lovely to speak to you.
That was Louise Davidson, Chief Executive of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.